uniform approval holders. Respirators are retested. If necessary, manufacturers are asked to make corrections to the product. In some cases, the respirators are recalled from the marketplace. Ensuring that all personal protective respirators meet uncompromising NIOSH standards is vital to the health and safety in the workplace, impacting not only American workers, but the ones they love. When it comes to personal protective respirators, know it's NIOSH approved and you can breathe easy.
As a key component of its mission, NIOSH is dedicated to advancing the state of knowledge and application of personal protective technologies, including air-purifying respirators, which will be referred to as respirators in this video. Various types of these respirators, such as filtering facepiece respirators and elastomeric half-mask respirators, are used to reduce personal exposure to potentially harmful aerosols. The term aerosol includes both solid and liquid airborne particles of varying size, shape, and density that are often invisible to the naked eye. Whether it's a virus or bacteria, concrete dust, or engineered nanoparticle, it's important to understand that the type of particle does not affect its ability to be filtered. A particle is a particle. This means that respirators can be used to protect workers from a wide variety of aerosols. For example, respirators can be used to protect a healthcare worker who might be exposed to tuberculosis or other airborne pathogens. To protect a construction worker from airborne particles generated by sawing concrete. Or to protect a laboratory technician who handles engineered nanoparticles. All respirators selected by Respiratory Protection Program administrators must pass NIOSH's stringent certification process. NIOSH certifies respirators based on how efficiently they filter airborne particles and how resistant they are to oil. For example, the most commonly used respirator is an N95 filtering facepiece respirator, which filters at least 95% of airborne particles and is not resistant to oil. To ensure optimum protection, respirator users should only wear respirators selected by their organization's Respiratory Protection Program administrators as being the most appropriate for their working conditions. As the user breathes and causes air to pass through the filter, the dense network of fibers in a respirator capture particles through a combination of three mechanical methods: impaction, interception, and diffusion. Some respirators contain charged fibers that use a fourth method, electrostatic attraction, to attract nearby particles. Impaction occurs when a particle's inertia prevents it from adjusting as the airflow carrying it into a respirator changes direction when it nears a filter fiber. In this capture method, the particle hits a fiber head-on and becomes stuck. Other particles can become attached when the airstream carries them within one particle radius of a fiber. This is referred to as interception. Diffusion occurs when smaller particles follow a random motion as they are bombarded by air molecules. Those that come into contact with a worker's respirator are captured by its network of fibers. With all of these capture methods, once a particle comes in contact with a filter fiber, it is removed from the airstream and strongly held to the fiber by molecular attractive forces. If the respirator contains electrostatically charged fibers, that charge will cause more particles to be captured. The method of capture is largely influenced by the characteristics of a particle, such as aerodynamic diameter, density, and charge. However, the filter's ability to capture a particle is not affected by whether that particle is a virus, concrete dust, or engineered nanoparticle. Remember, a particle is a particle. NIOSH tests respirator filters for their ability to capture particles that might be found in occupational situations. The conditions, such as particle challenge and the flow rate for certification testing of air-purifying respirators, are believed to represent near worst-case conditions for all types of workplaces, meaning the test conditions produce maximum filter penetration. This ensures that filters in NIOSH-approved respirators will collect hazardous workplace aerosols with very high efficiency. Based on the considerable collective knowledge of the scientific community regarding aerosol filtration, it is not necessary to test a respirator filter with a biological aerosol because certification testing applies a worst-case set of test conditions. Again, because a particle is a particle, when properly selected and used, NIOSH-approved respirators should provide the expected levels of protection against all types of workplace aerosols. This video was produced by the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health with assistance from RTI International, an independent nonprofit research institute. The focus of this video is how particles are captured. If you have questions about determining what type of respirator is appropriate for your...
So by this point, you're probably aware that your body needs oxygen to survive, right? In fact, every cell in your body needs that precious oxygen. Those cells use the oxygen to produce energy in the form of ATP, or adenosine triphosphate, a super important molecule, sometimes even called the molecular unit of currency. The cells use it to basically pay the molecules inside the cell to do their specific jobs. It's like one big factory with a bunch of workers that all have specific jobs needed to run the factory, and they only take ATP as payment. Now, the mitochondrion of the cell takes in oxygen and makes ATP to pay the workers through a process called oxidative phosphorylation. So the mitochondrion is like the factory's payroll department, right? When the cell doesn't get enough oxygen, and so payroll can't produce the ATP that they need to pay the workers to do their jobs, the whole cellular factory can be damaged or even die. And we call that process hypoxia, where hypo means less than normal, and oxia means oxygenation. When the oxygen comes in, typically it goes straight to payroll, specifically to the inner mitochondrial membrane, where oxidative phosphorylation takes place. Oxygen is used in one of the last steps and serves as an electron acceptor, and this allows the process to finish and produce ATP. So without oxygen, we can't finish oxidative phosphorylation and produce ATP. But why does the whole factory fall apart when payroll stops making ATP? Why don't they just pause for a bit or take a little break? Well, when certain workers stop doing their jobs, things get a little out of hand. One super important worker is the sodium-potassium pump on the cell's membrane. Pretty much like the bouncer that makes sure there isn't too much sodium diffusing into the cell, basically by pumping it back out every time it diffuses in and maintaining a concentration gradient. This process also keeps too many water molecules from passively diffusing into the cell. Think of it like this. Water molecules want to go every which way and are constantly moving back and forth, inside and outside the cell. But all these sodium ions on this side tend to physically block them from leaving that side. So over time, more water molecules get retained or almost trapped on the side with more sodium. In short, the more sodium molecules, the more water molecules. But our pump doesn't do all this for free, and it needs ATP. So without ATP, it stops pumping sodium back out, and sodium starts to diffuse in. And it keeps diffusing in, and the concentration gradient goes away. Now, with less sodium molecules in the outside blocking the water molecules from going into the cell, water follows the sodium in, which causes the cell to swell up. And when the cell swells up, a couple things start to happen. First, usually you have these really tiny microvilli on the cell's membrane, which sort of look like little fingers that help increase the cell's surface area and therefore help the cell absorb more things. When the cell swells up and gets all bloated, the water sort of fills these little fingers and reduces the surface area, which makes it harder to absorb molecules since there's less surface area, right? Also, sort of along the same lines, the cell can bleb, or bulge outward from all this water. And this is a sign that the cell's cytoskeleton, or this structural framework, is beginning to fail, and is letting water slip through. Finally, the rough endoplasmic reticulum, or the rough ER, also swells when the cell swells. And remember that the rough ER has all these little ribosomes on its outside, and these are really important for the cell in making proteins. But when the rough ER swells, they detach and stop making proteins, so protein synthesis goes down. All the ATP isn't immediately lost, though, when you lose oxygen and oxidative phosphorylation stops. Luckily, your cell can make ATP another way, called anaerobic glycolysis. Anaerobic meaning in the absence of oxygen. This is like the backup ATP generator, which isn't nearly as efficient and only produces a net of about 2 ATP molecules per glucose, whereas oxidative phosphorylation makes about 30 to 36. So it helps a little, but what also happens is it produces a byproduct called lactic acid, which lowers the pH inside the cell. This more acidic environment can denature or essentially destroy proteins and enzymes. Now, Up to this point, it's not all bad, because one super important thing about these processes that happen to the cell is that they're potentially reversible, meaning that if we all of a sudden get oxygen again and start making ATP, then these changes aren't necessarily permanent. After enough time, though, irreversible damage can happen to the cell. Kind of like the sodium-potassium